Were you surprised to hear how relatively unguarded the world's most priceless gems were at the Museum of Natural History?
Was I surprised that they had the window open in the room? Where they... I guess a little bit.
I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and this is Crime Writers On, the original true crime review podcast that digs into true crime, pop culture, TV, other podcasts. And this week, he was the cool 1960s surfer dude behind the biggest jewel heist in history. But was media darling Murph the Surf also a brutal killer? We'll talk about the new season of The Sneak. Joining me to get that done is journalist, true crime author, former defense investigator, licensed private investigator, and certified cat lady, Laura Bricker. Hello, Laura Bricker.
Hello, Rebecca.
Also with us is the author behind the noir novels known as the City Trilogy, host of the Strange Arrivals podcast. That's all about UFOs, by the way, Toby Ball. Good evening, Toby.
Hey, Rebecca.
Also with me is my real-life husband, true crime co-author, former TV journalist, and love of my life, real-life partner in crime, Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
Now, Kevin, for those who listen to the audio version of this podcast, you were not here with us last week, which is why we didn't do a video version last episode. What has been going on? You have some medical news to share. What is going on with you? As if I don't know.
As if you don't know. Well, I'll tell you, last week, 2 weeks ago, I had surgery on my vocal cords to repair my voice. A lot of you may remember that I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer about a year and a half ago, and that required me having 2 surgeries. And after the second one, I was diagnosed with dysphonia, which is something wrong with my voice, as you can tell. Basically, what happens is where you have the vocal folds, the left and a right side, they work together, they push towards the center to
like
make your
hamburger?
voice. Like a hamburger, I guess. Yeah.
Sideways hamburger, like a hot dog bun.
So one side was very weak, and it wasn't quite getting into the middle. And so what they did is they put an implant to push that left side closer to the center so it doesn't have to work as hard. Ooh. And I was told that my surgery was a success. This is a great way to get people to watch Facebook Watch, because you can check out my new scar.
Ooh, sexy.
Look at that. Looked like a pirate.
Wow. It was like you were in a fight with Murph the Surf.
Yeah. But I was very lucky because I went to probably the best hospital in the world to get this done, the Vocal Center at Mass General. You walk in and there are photos on the walls of all their famous patients. Julie Andrews, Adele, Roger Daltrey.
The Adele.
It's like going into Sardi's. And they said that I could send a photo.
Yeah.
They'll put it up on the wall.
Oh, they will.
Probably by the break room.
Oh, no.
Not anywhere near the lobby.
So, Kevin, the guy who fixed your voice is the same guy who fixed Adele's voice?
No. He works with him. He's in the other part where they don't take insurance.
Oh.
You walk in with a check. That's big money. But for what I got done, this was a guy who wrote an article about it.
He was taught by the best.
Taught by the best.
Wow.
It's like having a house designed by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
Wow.
All right. Shall we get into our review for this podcast?
May as well. We've gone this far.
Let's do it. Jack Murphy was a champion surfer who captured headlines in 1964 as a very cool jewel thief for stealing the world's largest ruby from a New York museum.
And then in this flat case with all these stones, there were emeralds and diamonds and rubies and sapphires and aquamarine and topaz and all. And so I just cut a corner of that case out. And I had a large squeegee I found in the janitor's box. And I just reached in and I squeegeed everything over there. So we got all of those.
Though he later went to prison for an unrelated heist, he escaped responsibility for the 1967 brutal slaying of 2 women in Florida. In season 2 of The Sneak, The Murders at Whiskey Creek from USA Today's For the Win and Wondery, host Nate Scott talks with Murphy about his life of crime. But was the charming thief known as Murph the Surf a more violent man than his legacy portrays? Now, we should talk a little bit about the plot of The Sneak. Mm-hmm. We're talking about a cool guy who was a legit, apparently, according to the host of this podcast, when they researched it and other reporters did as well, surfer champ, high dive acrobatic champ, could do all these amazing athletic things, worked with as like the Wallendas and did like escape artistry, was very handsome, hung out with other very handsome men, and then evolved into this, all around super cool George Clooney-esque criminal in the styles of like Ocean's 11, like pulled off these heists, did a lot of partying. Then, according to the podcast, he served very little time for the actual jewel heist at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that they were able to pull off. And then along the way was embroiled in this murder of 2 women. And, some of the questions that the podcast raises are, did he spend enough time in prison for the crimes that he committed? Is he a BS artist? Those are sort of the questions that are raised by the podcast. All right. So, Laura Bricker.
Yes.
Jack Murphy, Murph the Surf. We hear our podcast host talking to him, and we hear him in the first person in the podcast, and we hear him sort of spitting these fantastical tales. You've interviewed a lot of guys who have been involved in a lot of things, and women.
A lot of guys who've been in a lot of things. That's good.
Well, as
women.
as a true crime author, that is sort of part of our jobs, is to talk to people who very often spin yarns about the things that they were involved in. I would just love your initial impressions of Jack Murphy, Murph the Surf. Legit guy, full of it. What do you think?
So he's one of those people, and I think Kevin can probably relate, having been out doing, interviews. Like, he is totally full of it. And how many times have you gone on one of those interviews as a reporter or when I was a private investigator, and you're like, oh, for crying out loud, I wish this person would shut up, because they're like, me, and I did this and I did that. And you're like, yeah, okay, whatever. But within all of this fantastical talking, there actually is some truth. And so it's really hard because, like, obviously, this is why he was so good at what he did. This is why he was good at getting into these situations and swindling and getting involved in thefts and being aligned with people later in life that maybe were not on the correct side of the law, because he's a really good con man. But I totally could relate when I heard like the first episode, and Nate was talking about how, the guy didn't stop talking for like an hour when they got there. And then he was like, wait, let me plot out your podcast.
Like
yeah. Toby's like, stop. I've got your first 6 episodes like plotted out already. I'm like, oh my God. My
9.
God.
9 episodes.
Here are the chapters.
And there are 9 episodes coming, by the way.
Toby, this genre of podcast that sort of has emerged lately, I think you have a name for it, where a podcaster is just kind of listening to the tall tales being spun by someone, and then sort of as that is the jumping off point for the story. What do you think of this genre of podcast? What do you call it, and what do you think of it?
My term for it is the get a load of this guy genre. And
as opposed to the like Zoink Scoob.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, the first season of The Sneak was like this as well, where, the story was quite a bit different, but it was another guy who had this sort of crazy, grandiose story about like a much smaller time bank robbery he pulled off, but he tried to make it as much like a movie as possible. So a lot of it was this guy kind of talking through, his plan and his story, and then, having to get the BS meter going and checking on the stuff to see, how much of that can be confirmed. And so in this case, I thought what was sort of interesting was that, a lot of stuff kind of checks out, except for the violent stuff. And it's really the violence that ends up being the things they kind of have to either take on his word, or they suspect him of that he's not willing to admit to, because all the other stuff, seems to kind of check out when they do the actual research. And so then I think part of what this podcast is about is this more Ocean's 11, like you mentioned before, or is it more kind of Reservoir Dogs, where this is a guy who's, he's ready to kill people or have people killed in some, at least in that one circumstance where he said that guy who was coming in and like hassling like his girlfriend and his partner's mom or something. And he said, yeah, I made sure he had an accident.
Yeah. Kevin, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a history in American culture about loving the suave criminal involved in a heist because it's brainy and it's daring and we can see ourselves doing that and it's non-violent. And so that's kind of like the
Ocean's
charm.
11.
That side of the J.P. Morgan gem room had these large windows in it. Large windows that they kept open just so that there'd be an air ventilation in there.
The J.P. Morgan gem collection was so valuable it wasn't even able to be insured. And the museum had left the windows open.
But if you find out that there is an element of violence to the crime, does it sour it a little bit? Because, Murph the Surf's legend was just sort of like they went in with a hammer and broke the glass and were really patient and made off with a golf ball sized gem. But when you find out that he had a pistol and he was prepared to kill the guard if it came to that, then it does kind of change a little bit how we relate to that story. And it like Toby says, it does relate sort of to the whole question of violence in his legacy. Because, I mean, even before you get to the murders at Whiskey Creek, he's dropping a lot of hints that, he was capable of doing things in Boston and then, somebody has an accident and that he, other reporters have said that he likes to kind of play the idea, get in your head that, yeah, he's dangerous, and so you shouldn't cross him or whatever. So it takes, it's I want to see where this goes about how much is Nate and the rest of the sneak team going to chip away at that and give us a more realistic picture of who he really is.
But it sounds like they're working from one primary interview with him, right? So I don't know if they're going to...
series, I think it sounds
Well, I don't know
like,
if they're going to be able to get to go down to another Christmas parade this year, given the COVID crisis, and do another interview. Which, by the way, that was my favorite scene of the whole podcast, when they were just sitting at the Christmas parade in this little
in Florida. Yeah.
Well, they were talking about just sort of how surreal the holidays are in the South when it's like 70 degrees, people wearing Santa costumes.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like that scene personally. Toby, were you surprised to hear how relatively unguarded the world's most priceless gems were at the Museum of Natural History in New York City? That these completely unprepared and inebriated thieves could just on the spot, without any planning, after going to a bar, just get in there and steal them?
Was I surprised that they had the window open in the room? Where they? I guess a little bit.
And the battery to the alarm was dead.
Yeah, the whole thing. I guess it was a more innocent time. I don't know. I mean, they do that, and then they're like going out drinking with the gems, and they like travel with them in their pocket as they're going through.
I'll show you my ruby if you show me my diamond.
Yeah, the whole thing is.
Wow, it's so big and hard.
All right.
Wayne is not going to like that.
Sorry, Wayne.
Let me
I'm sorry.
apologize, Wayne, in advance.
Me and Wayne are simpatico.
So, yeah, I mean, it's it's hard to imagine. Like, it certainly wouldn't happen this way today. And now I kind of picture it's sort of the Mission Impossible, like Tom Cruise, like being lowered down on strings and with a flashlight in his
just
mouth.
going through an open window.
Yeah. They're just like, I went through an open window. And then his big escape ploy was to pretend he was talking to a guy walking a dog. And the cops were like, well, that couldn't possibly be him. He knows this person. And they keep moving along. It's like, all right.
You think the dog was involved?
Yeah.
There was a lot of like tape and glue aspects to the story, I guess, just because of the time in which it occurred. I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me is we have the interview with the guy now, who's an attorney now, but his father was the prosecutor in the Gems case. And they sort of talk about how, they basically kidnap one of the suspects, the collaborators, and bring him to Florida to try to find this missing ruby. And his boss in New York won't let him like get any resources for it, so he just has to like get in the water himself and try to find this missing gem in Biscayne Bay. Laura, have any of the prosecutors or defense attorneys you've ever worked with had to just do that kind of work themselves because their boss just wouldn't pay for someone to, I don't know, check and try to find out where the gems were?
to like climb in a bay. I can't say I've had anybody I work with do anything like that. But I mean, I will say when I worked at the public defender's office as an investigator, I saw attorneys do all sorts of things to get the job done because they didn't have the resources of, other attorneys' offices. But no climbing in bays with alligators now.
So when Nate and his producer do make it to Florida for their big interview with Jack to try to get as much of this story as possible, there is this scene after the Christmas parade where they go to the knockoff Applebee's and he does agree to meet with them. And apparently they've been trying to get in touch with them. This is the moment where he decides and like he meets them at the restaurant and we sort of hear the Nat tape of like kind of what a jerk he is, like razzing the waitress.
Yeah.
And then he like puts them in his car. And then there's just this long tape of them driving around with this guy who was in prison for 2 murders and they know
getting kidnapped,
committed other crimes. And I don't know, Laura, did you hear them even once say, hey, Murph, where are you taking us right now?
Well, they
were very disciplined. Very disciplined.
Yeah, I would have been like, oh, shoot. Whoop. Sorry, Wayne. I would have been like, oh, boy.
Nate was like looking in the back at his guy just going, shh, just keep.
Well, that was like my favorite scene of the whole podcast. I was like, oh, my God. Is he going to take them out to the swamp and feed them to the alligators or something? I was like,
but does he just want them to think he might?
He might.
You know?
But I will say there is something to be said for being in that sort of situation. Like I was thinking about, like there was one time that I was trying to get an interview for a case and it was some guy that I knew was like a convicted rapist. And he would only talk to me if I took him to the IHOP. And so I was at like this IHOP and he was like
Tutti Frutti, fresh and fruity
and
for everyone.
Yeah, he wanted like the one with like the extra whipped cream and strawberries. And I was like, sure.
Of course he did.
And like,
that's the Tutti Frutti, fresh
but I
and fruity.
remember like sitting there and I was like, oh, and I'm just trying to be like, this is no big deal. I'm at the IHOP. And I could feel like Nate and his producer might have been in the same situation. Like, yeah, okay, great. Have the extra whipped cream. Just don't kill me and feed me to the alligators.
Right. Don't mention the FBI, whatever you do.
That's right.
Yeah.
But Toby, there is like a ton of relying on Jack, aka Murph the Surf, as their primary source. Now, as I mentioned, they do actually talk to other reporters in the podcast. And, one of my critiques of the podcast is they do basically rehash a lot of reporting that other people did, which is fine. At least they're transparent about it and talk to other reporters. And so as a result, it does really seem like they are leaning on this conversation with Jack, aka Murph the Surf, as their primary source. Like that can sort of get you into some weird places as a journalist, right, Toby?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely. So I think that's, I think that's kind of what this is about, right? Is about, hopefully, we haven't listened to the last 3, or at least I haven't, but part of it is an assessment of who is this guy? We're going to let him talk and tell his story, and we're going to try and follow up on it as much as we can, but to a certain extent, it is what can you glean from what he tells you? And he won't commit to the 2 people that they actually know were murdered, but he's willing to make it sound like he definitely was involved in a bunch of things that you couldn't possibly follow up with because they're too vague.
Like 26 murders in Boston?
Right, yeah. Or some guy
Can't
who
talk about that.
have
Can't
an
talk
accident.
about that. Not talking about that time. Nope.
Yeah, it's kind of problematic. I think if you're going to enjoy this podcast, though, I think that's part of the enjoyment of it is trying to, along with Nate and company, assess like what is this guy's deal? Like what can we really take from what he's telling us? Because the story's like it's 100% entertaining, but it's also super disturbing if the violent stuff he actually did. I mean, that really makes him a total sociopath instead of like a fun-loving, guy who does all these kind of daring things, including steal stuff.
Laura, I had another journalistic issue with the podcast that I just want to run by you for your take. We hear him, Nate, our host, say in one of the episodes, sort of after first of all, there's some just structural issues. In episode 4, we hear a reference to the Whiskey Creek murders that we actually don't learn about what they are until episode 5. And I found very confusing when it was like, how did you feel when you found out he was implicated in the Whiskey Creek murders? And I was like, as a listener, I don't even know what you're talking about yet because I don't know what happened at Whiskey Creek. But then after we hear about the Whiskey Creek murders and what happened with these 2 women who stole these bearer bonds and then got involved with Jack and his crew, and then sort of, because they were unhappy with the deal they were being given as part of this scheme, one of them mentions on this boat ride with this potentially mysterious, like, 5th guy who was there that she's going to contact the FBI, and then these men kill her. And then we get this aside from Nate about how sorry he is that he has not put the victims into more of a frame. To me, it felt like a response to criticism they anticipated they might get.
Right.
But it happens.
You mean from crime writers on?
But it happens so well. I don't criticize people for not including a lot of information about the victims. I don't. That's not a criticism that I give because I understand that sometimes it's not available.
It's hard to get.
And also sometimes it is not the story that you're telling.
Well, I think at some point, and I don't think it really applies so much to this podcast, but I think there's a conversation to be had about how do you best, if the idea is you're going to kind of honor the victims by telling some of their story, how do you best do that? Because I think a lot of times, even when people are spending time doing it, they're so intent on providing this sort of completely positive image of the person that it doesn't end up being all that interesting either. It's, right. She lit up a room, she was so kind. Everybody looked to her, for advice, like all this stuff.
Do that with your Keith Morrison voice, Toby.
Yeah. But then, and I think an exception to it is the most recent Uncovered that we did, in which they talk about the victim who was a complicated person who lived a complicated life. And in that case, it was interesting because they were willing to be frank about it.
Right. Kevin, what were you going to say?
Oh, well, I was going to say, boy, it seemed like a real tragedy to spend all this time and money on this surgery and you don't call on me in the podcast. But we got to get to the murders for a second here, these women. And I'm not buying Jack's story about all these other professional people that he knew and then one guy whose name he didn't know.
No. Of course you're not buying that story.
It's so weak. We hear like versions of that all the time.
Right.
I didn't know who that person was.
Right.
So he said they're covering for one of the other people there.
I can't tell you.
She says, we were told that we would get some money and blah, 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 this and that and the other. And if we don't start getting some money, she says, if we don't get some money by tomorrow, she says, I'm going to the FBI. Wrong thing to say. Wrong thing to say in the world I live in. Within 30 seconds, they're both dead.
But I tend to believe that story about the girls want to go water skiing and the 2 guys look at each other like that's how we're going to do it. Because those bearer bonds, all you got to do is have them. And it's like...
But it is very realistic.
I mean, I've seen Die Hard. I know all about bearer bonds.
But isn't it realistic that no one knew what to do with them? I guess that is the thing.
You mean like when they get like these giant jewels and they don't know how to fence them? It's just a 535 carat ruby.
The question, Kevin.
Yeah.
Why does every bad guy, when they go to jail or prison, it seems, I don't want to say every bad guy, why do so many bad guys not only become religious, but actually become preachers? Are you buying that Jack is a full-on man of God at this point?
Well, I mean, I can't see what's in his heart. I mean, he's still to this day preaching, so I think that maybe...
Did you hear him razzing the waitress at that knockoff Applebee's?
Well, you can still be a man of God and still be a...
Wow.
I mean... Hey, Wayne, I'm looking at you. But I mean, I think he's still probably a man of God. Is he still insane? Is he still, That's why he didn't go to jail, because he was innocent by reason of insanity or whatever. Is he insane? No.
Yeah.
But...
Lar, what do you think?
I
don't know
think
why he found God, but it got him out of jail.
I think that
Exactly.
any opportunity that Murph the Surf has to be in front of people talking about himself and have an audience is a good opportunity for him. So, I mean, we just watched, Perry Mason, where we had the very, charismatic minister with the crowd. Like, hey, if you're Murph the Surf and you love to tell a good story and your story of redemption, like, hey, there's lots of people that will listen to you. And I think he really just likes people to listen to him talk.
Let's hang 10 brothers and sisters.
What do you think, Toby? What percentage convinced are you that Murph the Surf has found religion?
About 25%. I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because he, at least so far, it hasn't come up at all. He's talked about all kinds of stuff. He doesn't show any kind of, he's not even
remorse?
hinting at repenting,
right.
Or, now I've found a new path or whatever. So maybe he has, that's the one part of his life he doesn't want to talk about, but he's talked about a lot of stuff and that has not come up.
Toby, it's not the one part of his life he doesn't want to talk about. He doesn't want to talk about anything that veers into him either having to tell a lie or being guilty. It's like, there's a fifth man on the boat, but I can't tell you who he is.
Right.
There's a guy I killed, but I can't tell you anything about that. But I will tell you about that time I shot a cop and the time I went to Boston and killed all those people. It's like, to me, it seems like the things that aren't true are the things he doesn't want to talk about.
Yeah.
That's just my impression.
I mean, just saying, he could have been on the church's Christmas parade float because all the churches have a float in the Christmas parade. I'm just saying.
Jeep.
Yeah. I would, I would drive him. Ken has a new Jeep. I would drive him in the parade.
All right. Well, before we get to our thumbs up or thumbs down reviews, if you want to hear an expanded version of our discussion of season 2 of The Sneak, plus a bonus review of the Fatal Vision related podcast, Morally Indefensible, subscribe to the Crime Writers On podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please like and follow us right here on Facebook and Instagram. Tell us your review of The Sneak. We really want to hear it. Write in the comments here. And of course, you can join our amazing community of incredible listeners in our official Crime Writers On Facebook discussion group.
We know you're on Facebook.
We know.
You're obviously on Facebook.
And we have gotten a lot of people to join our group who have watched us on these videos. And they're all awesome. For exclusive podcasts and more, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/partnersincrimemedia. All right, I think it's time for us to do what we do. Should our listeners check out The Sneak Season 2, a story about Jack Murphy, Murph the Surf, a jewel heist, some murders in a place called Whiskey Creek, and a Christmas parade that involves a lot of Jeeps. Laura Bricker, thumbs up or thumbs down for you for Season 2 of The Sneak?
I'm gonna, so I think, and I'll kind of tell you who I think this podcast appeals to. I feel like this might appeal to a different sort of listener than somebody that wants like a journalistic investigation sort of deep dive. This is like a fun romp along with Murph the Surf as he's like recounting the glory days of being a jewel thief and a surfer and God knows what else. And so it's kind of an interesting behind the scenes look at somebody that, was involved in a number of criminal enterprises. And it's an interesting story. There are some things that I felt sort of problematic about it. Like there was definitely the after the fact, sort of addition of the victims in the murder case. And it's also, there was some structural things I would have moved around. But overall, I think it's a really interesting story. And I think if you liked something like Catch Me If You Can, the one with Leonardo DiCaprio, I mean, it's that sort of like the criminal outwitting the police sort of story. And here's the criminal and he's talking like in that one with Leonardo DiCaprio, doesn't he like eventually turns and works for the authorities to help them outwit other criminals. So it's that sort of story. So if that's what you're into, I would say thumbs up. And that's what my recommendation is.
Toby Ball, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for The Sneak Season 2 about Murph the Surf and all of the crimes he did or didn't commit before going to prison and then finding religion. What do you think, Toby?
So this is sort of faster paced than a lot of the podcasts we listen to. It reminds me a little bit of Keith Sharon's Crime Beat, the first season of that, which was about a bank heist. So I give it a thumbs up. It's not, it's not in my top 10 ever or whatever, but the story I think is interesting. There's enough going on with sort of trying to evaluate what the deal with Jack is, that kind of adds a second layer of things to think about. The storytelling is pretty straightforward. It's basically easy to follow. Again, I think we pointed out the sort of weird aside about trying to find out about the victims a little bit more. So yeah, thumbs up.
Kevin Flynn, what about you?
I'm going thumbs up. We've talked a lot about when we do nonfiction, that we as writers and journalists, we either betray our subject or we betray the audience. And right now, Nate Scott and his team are, I think, about to betray their subject, meaning that they could just tell Murph the Surf story. But I think that they sense that it isn't all that he's portraying it to be. My prediction is that at the end, they got to resolve that, because that's the conflict here, really, is that we're hearing the whole tale, but it's more than just sort of reliving the tale. It's an idea of like, let's test it a little bit. I like Murphy. He's a raconteur. I could probably sit and just listen to him tell his crazy stories all day. He spins this tale as a hipster crime guy, and it was socially acceptable in the 60s to kind of like that. They wrote a book. There was a movie starring Robert Conrad about him. He's lovable and likable, but if you find out that he was actually violent and responsible for at least 2 murders of these women and other stuff, it does sort of change our perception of him. So for me, thumbs up, and good job so far for these guys for not swallowing the lure.
I'm a thumb sideways for this podcast. I can't say that
You're going to make me create a thumb sideways graphic?
Sorry. I can't say that it's bad. However, there are some things about it that bother me that keep me from being able to recommend it for real. One is I think the writing is for print and not audio. There are sentences where you can literally hear the semicolons and commas. Like there's a sentence where they're describing the victim of a home invasion and they say, a widow, she lived alone. I mean, that's just not the way a person would talk. And so I really do think this podcast could benefit from a script editor that knows how to write for audio. There's a lot of moments like that in the show that pulled me out of it. I do think there are some issues with the organization of the story. Maybe they followed Murph the Surf's storyboard a little too closely, because I don't really care about all of the ins and outs of their conversations with him as much as I do about the crimes they actually committed and what happened afterwards. And there's just a lot of just kind of indulgence to his tale telling, which I don't really love, because it's very clear to me that Murph the Surf wants to be the center of the story. He's working on a film about his life right now. He's already had a film made about him. He's been the subject of books. He's been the protagonist in magazine articles, New York Times pieces. I want to hear from Alan. Like, what about Alan? To me, way more handsome, way more interesting. So there is just sort of an indulgence to this podcast that I don't love. Like, they are giving this guy yet another stage to tell a story that he's had the opportunity to tell over and over and over again. So, I mean, it's fine. I can't say it's terrible. I don't really like the theme music, but that's a whole other conversation. So it's a thumb sideways for me. I probably will check out the next season of The Sneak, but this one, I can't say it's bad. I also can't say it's good. All right, now it's time for my favorite part of the podcast, a little something I like to call the crime of the week. Listen to you. You're back.
It was not great.
Almost.
It'll get better and better each week, son, I promise.
Samir Anwar's parents remember when the 5-year-old New Zealand boy shoved a Lego piece up his nose. Neither mom and dad nor the doctor could find it, and because he wasn't feeling any pain, they assumed the piece would pass safely through his digestive system. Flash forward 2 years, right after Mom baked a fragrant batch of pink cupcakes, Samir took a big sniff and then blew out the missing piece. The arm of a Lego character was covered in fungus, but otherwise harmless.
God.
The Guardian reports his parents were grossed out. Yes, rightfully, but the boy was psyched to retrieve his lost piece. Incidentally, in 2018, a group of doctors hoping to ease parents' fears each safely swallowed a Lego piece to see how long it would take to, get this, literally, a brick. Now, panel, the Lego was a real surprise, but what was this boy hiding up his other nostril? Laura Bricker, I'm going to start with you.
A little snack for later.
Oh.
Toby Ball,
He just had an endless supply of that, too. He just-
Just keep going in there.
Toby Ball, what do you think was in this boy's other nostril?
My TV remote.
Ooh, that's good.
Kevin Flynn, what about you?
I think it was the Eagle Diamond that they never recovered for that heist. Vague.
I mean, wasn't it just boogers? Let's be real, it was just boogers.
There's a lot of boogers.
And let me just tell you one thing. I would 100% rather sniff a Lego brick than step on one. I'm so glad those days are over for me. That's going to do it for us. Remember to follow us right here on Facebook. We'll be back next week with another crime review. On behalf of all the crime writers, all of us, thanks so much for watching. We will catch you later.
Later.
Later.